Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to the Bloody Fork Homestead. And I introduced kind of a mini-series concerning food security, the 5 P's of food security. And the first thing that we considered was procuring food. That simply means buying it, or you can barter for it, different things. But being able to obtain food, and for most of us, that entails going to the grocery store and buying it. It's one thing that you have to do to have food security. You have to get it somehow, procure it. But then the next thing that we consider is producing food. We have to be able to produce food. I think to have real food security, many of us have recognized when you go to the grocery store, sometimes it's not there. And the other issue is, can you afford it? If you have a median-sized income and below, it's tough. Inflation has kicked in big time. So producing food, learning to produce something for ourselves. We considered that the last time. But that leads to the third P, and that is preserving food. If you produce a lot of food, one of the things you have to do is be able to preserve it. Now, many of you preppers out there, you know how to keep food in a certain sense. You try to preserve food. So you may have buckets that you put dried grain in, or dried beans. You may have some freeze-dried food storage, or you have some kind of canned goods that you've stored up. And that's part of preservation, but you have to get beyond that. You have to know how to continually preserve what you're producing, unless you want to eat beans the rest of your life. Or maybe you want to eat that freeze-dried stuff. Can you have real food security by simply storing it up? I don't think so. I think you have to know how to produce it on your own, and you need to know some things on how to preserve it. There's a lot of different ways to preserve food. There's different things like you can smoke food to preserve it, to make it last. You can freeze dry food. You can pickle food. You can have the fermentation process. You can also can food, or you can freeze food. Different ways to preserve food. Now, many people have learned some things about food preservation. Some are learning to can, some are learning how to freeze what they produce, different things. But for many people, this was a way of life. It was a way of life to simply produce the food and to preserve it. A fascinating book was written by my dad's cousin, who was a priest. But it's called Pick Up Stuff by Ernie Ranley. He's passed away now, but when he wrote this book, he recollects what things were like on the farm. This was back on the farm in Ohio. And what's fascinating about this book is there's a couple of different things. One is pictures. And right here, and you probably can't see this very well, but there's a picture of the family. There's a picture of the family, and they have 13 kids. You have trouble raising one, don't you? 13 of them. Of course, many of them became farmhands after a while. 13 kids. But how do you feed 13 kids? How did they feed 13 kids? This was back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that the book is kind of based around those years. This was during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was from 1929 to 1939. So during this time, this family ate very well. They didn't have any food shortage. They didn't go to the grocery store to buy most of their food either. Most of it they produced, and most of it they preserved. There's a fascinating chapter in here on the cellar. the root cellar or the basement that they had. And I just want to read a couple of things concerning the cellar, just to show you how they preserve food. This was back before they didn't necessarily have any freezers at this time. Electric was still making its way into many rural communities, but Ernie says this: the cellar is where potatoes and sauerkraut were stored, along with dozens upon dozens of canned fruit, canned vegetables, and canned meats. So evidently they canned, but they also fermented food, and they also had potatoes stored up. There were no ice boxes, no refrigerators, no deep freezes. Mom bought very few canned foods in tin cans outside of sardines and tuna fish, so trips to the cellar were frequent. Even the homemade bread was stored in a big white crock covered with a simple white cotton dish towel. It goes on, talks about that there was cupboards, and there was shelving there. There were mason jars full of applesauce and beans and peas and beets and the like. Then in the southwest corner were two big wooden bins full of potatoes. One bin held the early potatoes. Through daily family consumption, we emptied that bin around Christmas. But then there were the later potatoes, and that saw them all the way to the next potato harvest. It was a way of life. It was a way of life to produce food. It was a way of life to preserve food. It goes on and he talks about crocks on the floor. There were crocks of sauerkraut. There were barrels of cider, applejack, and vinegar. Sometimes they made root beer. But he goes on to say, in a sense, the cellar was what Thanksgiving Day is all about. He said every time that you would go to the cellar, you would realize that God provided in an abundance. And they had enough wisdom to take that abundance and to store it. They had different ways to store it. I believe we need to get back to this. Food survival, food security is dependent on being able to produce food and also to preserve food. You have to know how to preserve it. We have to make this normal again. It has to be a normal thing that if you're looking for something to eat, you go to where you've stored it up. And there's all kinds of different ways to store food. We have to get back to that again. I believe that many preppers are short-sighted, that you've missed the boat in some ways, because you think food security is simply about hoarding up more and more and more and more. And the more you have hoarded up, the better security you're going to have. That's a bunch of malarkey. You better know how to produce some food, and you better know how to preserve some food. You better have a lifestyle where you're doing these things. And you'd better know how to do it in a community of people who can do that together. Because you don't know what your life's going to be like tomorrow. You can store up everything for the next 100 years. But you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know if you're going to have a stroke and not able to do something. You don't know if your family is really going to be provided for unless you are part of a community. That's really the next thing we're going to look at in some depth, and that is how to perpetuate what you produce and what you preserve. Being able to teach other people and how to participate in that in a community. If you don't do that, I don't think you can have real security. You see, many have the attitude, yes, the worst is going to happen, but I'm going to be okay. My family's going to be okay, but the rest of the world, they can go to hell. It doesn't work that way. You can't really have food security that way. If you don't care about your neighbor across the street, or if you don't care about some of the other people that you come into contact on a regular basis with, you're really not going to have food security. The only way that we can really have it is to perpetuate it. Teach other people how to grow things, how to preserve things, how to be ready for tough times. Unless we take that step, I don't think you can really have genuine food security. I'll put it out there. I know it will appease some people off, but that's the way it is. It's not just you and your little family. It's a community. That's what it's about.